Hi everyone, you know that old saying, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, teach him to fish and you feed him for a lifetime? Well, this show is about that, but it's not about fish. It's about rifle scopes. Hi everyone, Ron Spomer here, talking about inexpensive rifle scopes. I see a lot of videos on YouTube rating scopes, the 5 best scopes for under $500, the 10 best scopes for under $300, whatever. Those are great, but they always pick a scope, a particular scope, at the top of the heap that might not be ideal for your applications, and it might change the next year. There are new brands coming on the market, and there are new lines within their scope line, and things change from year to year. So I just think it's probably better to learn how to fish so you can select your own best scope. And that means we need to understand what's inside of a scope and what makes one scope cost upwards of $3,000 and another one might go for a list price of $150. Oh, wow, that's a big spread. What exactly is going on? You know, they don't look that different, except for size, perhaps. So let's look into scopes and decide what we need to look for in an inexpensive scope that suggests it's going to perform for us. And I think what we need to consider, first of all, is the kind of use we want to put it to, obviously. If it's going to be a short-range rifle for hunting maybe out to 100 and 200 yards or so, that tells you you don't need 20x magnification, for instance. You can keep it kind of small and light. But even if you've got a rifle that can reach out to 400 or 500 yards, like this .284 Winchester, you can get by with a relatively small and inexpensive scope on that if it has the right ingredients. And those right ingredients are in 2 categories, I would say. Mechanical quality and rugged durability, and then optical quality. And I think too many of us put way too much emphasis on optical quality when what we really need is durability and consistency. Essentially, a rifle scope is a glorified front sight. There's a reticle or a crosshair in there that you adjust so that it strikes where you're aiming, the same as a sight on an old-fashioned rifle, an open sight. And then once it's there, it needs to stay there. That's its most important job. You don't need it to hit 5 inches to the left one day and 5 inches to the right the next day because the scope doesn't have the integrity internally to stay on target. So number 1, rugged durability and keeping that sight on target. After that, optical quality so great that you can count the rings of Saturn or the moons around Jupiter. Hey man, that's fine, but you don't really need it. Think about it. You're glassing with your binocular to find your game. When it's time to shoot it, you don't need to count every hair on its body. You just need to see that reticle on the sticking place. So, durability is my number 1 option. Now, I'm going to have a list here that I'm going to put up for you guys so you can review it, take your time and study it. I'm going to try to hit most of the points here, but I might miss a few, so jump in on that and think seriously about what you need in a scope for the kind of hunting you do. Now, I am kind of a mountain hunter. I like to really get out and hike and roam, so I've always liked lightweight scopes. And it just happens that lightweight scopes are actually probably where you want to go with an inexpensive scope, because the bigger and heavier your scope is, the heavier the lenses in that scope are, and the more likely things could shift or break under recoil. Think about the inertia. You have a big, heavy objective lens up front. The rifle recoils and that lens wants to shift, break out of inertia. It's going to put stresses on the mounting system that could shift it enough to screw up your focus or even break the lens. So keeping things small, like this little guy, can make a difference. Doesn't have to. I mean, they can build them so that they'll last, but one of the things you want to consider. Also, a 1-piece tube instead of 2. You can take a turret unit and then thread it and screw the front half of the scope on and the back half of the scope on, but then you have 2 weak points right there. Not only could it bring moisture into the scope, but it could break more easily there because you've weakened the aluminum tube by cutting those grooves in it to thread it in. Most scopes these days will be a 1-piece tube, and that's a nice feature. The other thing that's going to introduce potential problems are all the bells and whistles. This has an adjustable objective for focusing and removing parallax. Parallax removal is a good thing if you're target shooting or precision long-range shooting, but for hunting out to anywhere out to about 300 yards, it's really not that necessary. As long as you keep your eye dead centered in the scope and you're not shifted off to the left or right, even if that scope has some parallax, you're not going to see it until you shift off. So if you fit nicely with your rifle, you don't have to worry too much about parallax. If you have a parallax adjustment on here, when it works fine, but if you ding that scope, if you bang it right there and bend it just a slight amount, that's going to move the image in relation to the reticle, and you're now going to be off zero. So it's just another part that can break. It's not saying it can't work. This one has worked fine for me for several years, but for longevity, the fewer bells and whistles, the fewer moving parts, the longer that scope's going to last and be durable. Now, one thing we cannot tell about a scope's durability is what kind of metals they're using, what sort of internal parts they're using, and how durable those might be. You're not going to tear that scope apart, go inside and say, oh yeah, this was a cheap piece of nothing. Oh, I wonder how I put this thing back together. So you have to sort of take their word for it. I would definitely study their literature. Even sometimes they'll put a lot of things on the box, like aluminum, aircraft aluminum main tube, one piece, and that's all great. What kind of metals are they using, though, on their adjusting turrets, on the threads? When you pop open your turret, well, let's just make it easy and use this one. Have an external turret and you're turning it, and you hear it going, yeah, those are parts moving against one another, and eventually those parts are going to wear down and or wear out. So you've got to use really high quality materials for a scope that does a lot of adjusting like that. So I would say try to resist those kinds of adjustments. Do you really need those? If you've got a long-range target scope, obviously you do, but just remember, those are the kinds of things that are going to give you trouble because there's just more bells and whistles to break. Doesn't mean they can't make some pretty darn good stuff. Now, I have a buddy who's had a scope, and it's an inexpensive Banner. Is this a Banner right here? It's a Banner scope. A Bushnell Banner, a simple one though. It's just no adjustments, no turning anything other than zeroing the scope. But he has had that Banner scope on a 270 Remington pump action rifle. He had that for about 10 years. Then he took it off and mounted it on a 22-250 lever action rifle. And he's been using that for at least 30 years. So he's probably got 40 years in that scope, and it still maintains its zero. And he still hunts with it. So inexpensive scopes can last a long time, but stay away from the elaborate parts. That never helps. Now, optical quality. This, for some folks, is a huge deal. As I said, I really don't think it's all as important as this mechanical stuff. But you can tell what's going on optically just by looking through the scope. So when you look through the scope, gosh, that is just as sharp and clear as I could want. I definitely see my crosshair 400 yards up the hill there. I can easily determine what that blade of grass is on that weed sticking up and put the crosshair on that target. Now, that stuff is not going to necessarily be the same when the light gets bad. That's what you want to look at. So if you can, test your scopes under bad lighting conditions and then see if you can see your target in the crosshair. So early morning, late evening, when the sun's down near the horizon, look toward it. And as you get closer and closer to the sun, it's shining directly onto your lens. That's when it's going to show up as flare and glare. And some scopes that don't have good coatings are going to really show some glare and flare. And sometimes you can't even see the target through all of that orange haze. So look for that. Now, what causes that flare and glare? I'm glad you asked, because this is one of the best bangs for your buck. Anti-reflection coatings. As I think you can maybe see it here. I don't know if you're going to see any reflective colors on there. But generally, when you look at the objective on a scope, you're going to see blue or green colors. That's telling you there are anti-reflection coatings on there. That is a huge deal for brightness. Most of us think, oh, you've got to get a scope with a big objective lens to let more light in. That is true. The downside to these big objectives, this one's a 50, by the way, is that they make your scope bigger. You have to set it up higher on your rifle. We've already talked about the heavier lens that could recoil and break. So there are some drawbacks to going bigger and bigger. There are no drawbacks to getting anti-reflection coatings on your lenses. This is the big deal for light transmission through a scope. If you just have raw glass, 4% of the light bounces off of it when it strikes it, and then there's 7, even 9 different lenses inside of some rifle scopes, and there's light bouncing off of every one of those, 4%, holy mackerel, you're losing a lot of light. But if you put one fine little microscopically fine layer of anti-reflection coating material on there, you can reduce that light loss by 50%. So you put multiple layers on that, that's where you get this crazy brightness that you see advertised sometimes as like 95% light transmission, 94%, and all this good stuff. Those numbers can kind of fool you because you don't know if they're talking about one lens surface and one lens or the entire system, but it's just good to know that anti-reflection coatings reduce light loss, and that is not costing you any size or weight. It's just like free, except for it costs a lot of money to buy those coated lenses. So in addition to looking for this optical quality when you're looking at the sun and looking late night to see if you can see things, realize that the anti-reflection coatings are helping a lot, and that's what you want to shop for. So for instance, on this banner box, I read, it has one-piece tube construction, it's waterproof, fog-proof, multi-coated lenses. Ah, that sounds great, doesn't it? Multiple layers of anti-reflection coating lenses. But there's a little bit of a code going on here. Multi-coated lenses. How many? Is it just the objective lens? Or is it the next lens in and then no more? Or is it the eyepiece lens? It has to almost say fully multi-coated optics to mean that every air-to-glass lens surface has multiple anti-reflection coatings. That's going to give you your greatest light transmission. Now, you can't tell if it has 2 layers for multi-coating, that's multi, or 5 or 7, because some of the expensive scopes have that many. They really tune that up for maximum light transmission. But it's way better than not having any coated lenses or one coating, single coated. So if it advertises this scope has coated lenses, it might have 1 layer of anti-reflection coatings on 2 lenses. That would qualify. So take your time to study that and kind of figure it out. And you should be able to see it too, especially if you can compare a couple of scopes in that low light situation. You're going to pass more light through and you're going to knock off a bunch of that flare and glare. So when you're looking at that rising sun, and you don't see the orange haze and flare and glare, that suggests that they've got some pretty good, effective multi-coatings. That's where you're going to get your brightness without getting a bigger scope. And that's definitely worth having. So that kind of sums it up, guys. Exactly why one scope sells for $200 and the next one sells for $3,000-$4,000. A lot of that has to do with not just the materials they used in making that scope, but where the scope was made and the reputation of the brand. I mean, if money is no object, why not buy the best? Money's not an object. Obviously, you want the best, right? That's why I have this old versatile tractor here instead of a brand new John Deere. I can afford this one, but it's a rugged, durable tractor. Despite what it looks like, it just keeps on running. So that's what you want in a scope. So consider the reputation of the brand and where that scope was manufactured. European scopes, especially Austrian and German, they have a reputation for the highest quality, and they have got some extremely high quality scopes because they just pull out all the stops. They put the best of everything in there. They got the best workers putting them together, and those people get a lot of money per hour of work, I would assume. Whereas something made in China, who knows what those people have got to do that job. There are some countries that have slave labor. I don't know that anybody's making scopes with slave labor, but definitely there are price differences in your workmanship, in your labor costs. So if you're having a scope that's been made somewhere in a Pacific Rim country, you might be getting a lot better price just because the average worker gets lower wage. Plus, there's a lot of competition now from all these new brands coming out, and that's nice because it keeps the prices down. If you're trying to sell a scope in a crowded field, you're going to have to lower that price or offer more features, and we get the benefits of both. So, I think that pretty much sums it up. Again, guys, look at the page I'll put up here for you with all the features that I recommend you study and look for. And I think you can find yourself a rifle scope that's going to be sharp enough, bright enough, effective enough for hunting and target shooting to a degree. Once again, the more elaborate you get, though, the more easy it is for that scope to screw up somewhere along the line. So be careful in that regard. Hey, a couple of quick extras, guys. If you're looking for that long-range shooting and you're not trusting the dialing on an inexpensive scope, you don't have to necessarily have a dialing system like this. You can use the ballistic drop compensator reticle because there's no added weight there and there's no mechanical movements. I think that's going to last you a lot longer. You just have to learn to select which MOA hash mark down the scale, and it's a pretty inexpensive way to get that ballistic long-range performance you're looking for. So you want to consider that. Now, something else you want to look for when you're testing an inexpensive scope, just all the mechanical moves and how they feel. Even something as simple as a turret cap. I know on some really rough scopes, it's hard to even get them started, and they're pretty rough, so the machining is not all that precise. I don't see that much anymore these days. Back in the day, though, it was really problematic. And it's not a huge deal, but it just suggests the quality of the workmanship is maybe not all that great. Another option is to take a flashlight, look inside, and just see how clean things look. Sometimes you'll see scratches, you'll see screw heads that are partly stripped out. Again, that doesn't happen much these days anymore either, but it's worth looking at. It's always fun to look inside a scope and see the parts anyway. And then the dials, mostly it's going to be your power ring. If it turns smoothly and consistently, or does it feel a little bit rough in some places? Just tells you a little bit about the workmanship and the quality of the materials. Same with the diopter adjustment. If things feel smooth and they feel like they're good quality, probably what they are. Another tip is to keep things simple with a fixed power scope. Now, a lot of people think, what fixed power? Are you going back to 1950? Well, we did get deer back in 1950. But on a rifle like a 30-30, where you're probably only going to shoot out to 150, 200 yards at the most, you don't need a big zoom scope. Get a 4X fixed power scope, and there are so few moving parts in there, that thing's going to last forever. You can really get a deal there. The problem, though, is that most manufacturers don't even offer them anymore. This is a 6X fixed scope from Loophole, and I don't know if they even offer that. I think they still do, but man, that is a smart move. Fixed power scope, and you are going to last a long, long time. Here's another tip that you might not want to follow, but you sure could. If your scope comes with a fully guaranteed waterproof attachment to it, throw that thing in the water. Why wait until you're out hunting on a snowy or rainy day and you find out that your scope is fogging up? You can test that stuff when you get it before you even mount it on your rifle. So ask when you buy it at the store, hey, if this thing leaks, can I bring it back? They'll probably tell you, well, no, that's the company's guarantee. You'll have to send it to them. Check their guarantee. Read the paperwork and see if it says that this thing is guaranteed waterproof to a submersion depth of 2 feet or 10 feet or whatever it is. And then put it in a bucket of water or the sink underwater and test it. And that'll really tell you whether or not it's worth it. And you can send it back and not mess around with putting it on your rifle and then finding out it leaks. So what I do is I'll put a scope in the water and I'll look for bubbles to come out. You're going to see a few because there's cracks in there where the moving parts are. Once all that air is out, though, the bubbles should stop. If you just keep seeing bubble, 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 that suggests there's a leak, because these things are slightly pressurized. They're purged with nitrogen gas, sometimes argon gas, and that keeps the humidity out of the scope. If there's a leak, of course, it's coming in, that gas is bubbling out. But if you really want to test it, take the caps off, because some of them will be sealed at the cap, and then they might leak. I don't know if you want to, but I mean, if you're dialing your scope, if you take the cap off and you're in the field dialing it and it's raining, you need to know that that thing is going to be waterproof. So take the caps off and then turn all the dials while it's underwater. Sounds crazy and it's a little bit painful to do it, but if it's guaranteed, you can send it back if it leaks. And I would turn the power ring too. Just move everything underwater while you do it. And if you want, leave it there for a while. Sometimes it's a really slow leak. And then take it out, get it fully dried, and look and see if you can see anybody swimming around in there. If there's moisture inside, you're going to know it. So those are my tips for selecting an inexpensive scope that's going to be durable. I would like to say this about scope manufacturers. You guys are making a heck of a product for a heck of a price. I sometimes cannot believe the suggested retail asking price of these scopes that have fully multi-coated lenses. They'll sometimes have an ED or HD glass up front. By the way, that means well, it does is it controls color fringing. Extra low dispersion ED glass or high definition HD glass, pretty much all the same thing, and it's usually the objective lens, and it reduces color fringing at high magnifications. Not essential. It's mostly a selling point on scopes until you get up over about 15 power. But then it starts to show because it pretty much eliminates color fringing around your subjects. But getting all that stuff for under $300 is just absolutely amazing. So look for the features, look through that scope. If it looks like it's going to be a winner for you and it says it's got all the right parts in there, the only thing you're not going to know is the quality of the internal parts and if they're going to last or not. But hey, for $200, it's probably worth the gamble. This is Ron Spomer. If you have any questions on scopes and selecting scopes and stuff, jump onto ronspomeroutdoors.com, our website, and send in a comment and ask a question. Of course, our patrons on Patreon, we answer their questions anytime they come in. We're always happy to help you folks out. You're first in line, first in time. And stay tuned to Ron Spomer Outdoors podcast on your favorite podcatcher, where we answer questions as well. Until next time, this is Ron Spomer. Hunt honest and shoot straight.